Or to kind of modify my title to Uses and Abuses of International Law on the disvalue of bullshit legal arguments. And the author was a bit shocked, but actually bullshit is a thing in philosophy of law nowadays. What do we make of such arguments? And I would be using this word a lot during the presentation. So,
I allow it, it's just
so okay. So although to laypersons, Russia's invasion of Ukraine can seem like an exercise in lawlessness, Russia was in fact careful to craft legal justifications in support of its invasions. The thing is that these arguments are so weak and have been basically universally rejected. They're in fact so weak that the question arises whether Russia itself believes in these legal arguments. Some argue that these arguments are merely intended to discredit the West by mimicking similar, that's a big question, arguments made in the context of Kosovo or Iraq. In any case, this had led to much debate about what to make about such legal arguments, or to be more precise, on the value of advancing evidently bad legal arguments. So the debate usually revolves around this question. Does the fact that one appeals to international law in order to justify horrendous acts, the type of bad arguments that I call here bullshit legal arguments, rather than to non-legal justifications such as interest, morality, or just arbitrary will, does this strengthen the international legal system or weakens it? So in parallel to the argument that Russia's invasion has shaken the foundation of the international so-called rules-based order, others point out that the use of legal argumentation by Russia actually demonstrates the centrality of law in the international system. So in this talk, I want to delve deeper into this debate, and I will show there are two main positions. One that finds that making bullshit legal arguments is worse than flat-out acting outside the law. The other, conversely, assigns inherent value to legal argumentation. And what's interesting is that I didn't know, but when I'm working on this talk, is that this discussion actually goes back to the roots of international law, or modern international law. So what we'll do here is first I will try to theorize or conceptualize what I mean by bullshit legal arguments. I then will briefly show why Russia's legal arguments qualify as such, and I will follow my previous colleague presenter here. And then I will introduce the two positions on the value of bad legal arguments, or disvalue of bad legal arguments, and offer some preliminary thinking about them in the context of Russia and Ukraine, and that will be kind of open-ended. So first I want to offer a definition of a bullshit legal argument. So philosopher Harry Frankfurt in recent decades has defined bullshit as arguments that have no connection or concern with truth. As such, and I'm kind of paraphrasing Frankfurt's work, they are different from lies in which the liar is concerned with truth even by trying to subvert it. So Frankfurt concluded the bullshit is actually more harmful to truth than lies because of its complete disconnect with the truth. Now, international legal scholar Fuad Zorbayev has recently used Frankfurt's theory to argue that Russia's legal arguments are bullshit and thus worse than lies. My problem with this approach is that it revolves around the intent structure of the state. Whether something is bullshit or non-bullshit will be determined about what we think Putin thinks is the reality of the law. So what I want to do here is advance jurisprudential, if you wish, definition of bullshit arguments. So first of all, there are legal arguments. And by legal argument, I mean arguments that, sorry, what is this bullshit?
It's
everywhere.
No, it's my computer. No, they're legal in the sense that they are following their argumentative structure of legal claims. In the most basic sense, they are arguments that appeal to some settled authority for validity. For instance, when Putin says that Russia is exercising its rights under Article 51 of the UN Charter, which he did, Russia is appealing to a settled legal authority, the UN Charter, of the highest level. In this sense, by the way, legal arguments are different from whataboutism, which Russia also engages in, which is not a really legal argument unless you phrase it as a precedent or the formation of customary international law. But whataboutism in itself does not conform to the structure of the international legal argument. Now, bullshit legal arguments can be defined in formalist as well as realist terms. In formalist terms, a bullshit legal argument is one which utterly and clearly does not fall with the scope of positive law, whether in terms of facts or in terms of the legal interpretation. So in terms... I have some feedback. So in Hartian terms, it's an argument that doesn't even fall within the indeterminate penumbra of the legal norm, but rather contradicts its core. In realist terms, a bullshit argument is one which utterly and clearly contradicts the consensus in the relevant interpretive community, and therefore there is no chance whatsoever that it would be accepted. And there is, of course, overlap between these categories, but what I want to show here is that bullshit arguments may exist whether you're a formalist or not. Even if you're a critical legal scholar and don't believe that law has any inherent meaning, you have to accept that bullshit arguments exist, at least in the realist sense. So I would argue that all of Russia's legal arguments justifying the invasion of Ukraine fall into the category of bullshit arguments, both on formalist and realist terms. And the previous speaker elaborated on this argument, so we'll just kind of skim the recognition of the so-called breakaway republics of Donetsk and Lugansk. It's important for Russia because that opens the argument that Ukraine occupies these territories and now it can act in collective self-defense for the benefit of these territories. It opens... Okay, I was asked to be slow, more slowly. Opens the possibility of annexation of these territories by the request of these so-called states, which actually took place. It can be a springboard for broader claims of collective self-defense. And Russia's legal arguments for this recognition of these so-called breakaway states is actually, as my previous colleague has described so aptly, that Ukraine's borders are fictitious and arbitrary and basically meaningless. And also that the people of Donetsk and Lugansk have suffered genocide and therefore possess what we call in international law the right of remedial secession. They can just break away because of the crimes committed against them. Now, these are bullshit legal arguments because they clearly contradict the principle of territorial integrity in the post-World War II order, which does not question settled borders and does not recognize the unilateral secession. I would even argue if there is one clear international legal rule of the 20th century, of the late 20th, since the mid-20th century, is this one. Right? Even if there was a right to remedial secession under international law, to argue that Ukraine committed genocide against Russian speakers in Ukraine fails both on factual and interpretive terms to constitute a remotely credible legal argument. Russia also claims collective preventive self-defense against the expansion of NATO. This is a bullshit argument because Article 51 requires an armed attack, or at least an imminent armed attack, and no claim of preventive self-defense has ever been accepted. Again, Russia's so-called referendums in the four territories and attempted annexation, it argued on the basis of some kind of convoluted understanding of the right to self-determination, but this runs counter to the prohibition on annexation of occupied territories, regardless of any so-called referendum. And in fact, all of these arguments were almost universally rejected in numerous United Nations General Assembly resolutions. So what do we make of this? Should the use of such arguments be condoned since they're at least legal arguments by appealing to authority? Or is it preferable that no legal arguments would have been made at all and Russia would just advance the types of arguments that the previous speaker exposed as reflecting some kind of national narrative? And I want to present two possible answers and maybe reflect a bit about their plausibility. I didn't take time. How much time do I have?
10 more.
Okay, good. So, actually, the issue of bullshit legal argument is not new. It actually preoccupied some of the pioneers of international law. No less of an authority than Emir de Vattel, the great 18th century international lawyer, was concerned with the problem of bullshit legal arguments. Now, to Vattel, the problem of bullshit arguments goes to the core of what he called the sanctity of treaties. To Vattel, treaties are sacred, because everything that the common safety and peace and security of mankind, that's his, of course, conceptualizations, requires to be inviolable. Everything that security of mankind requires to be inviolable should be considered sacred among nations. And the sanctity of treaties is so central, he argued, that a violation of any treaty is an injury to all nations. Accordingly, all nations can retaliate to a violation of a treaty, what we would call today erga omnes, right? That every violation of a treaty is actually a violation against what he called mankind in general. But Vattel was worried, however, about the possible consequences of such a rule, if each treaty violation would trigger a right to retaliate of the entire of all nations. And this is what led him to discuss bullshit legal arguments. So he tried to define the concept of bullshit legal arguments as a way to distinguish between violations of treaties that would give rise to erga omnes rights and those that won't. So he differentiated between violations of a treaty in which a sovereign has, and I quote, good reasons for thinking himself liberated from his engagements. Let's call this non-bullshit arguments. And arguments that are evidently frivolous, or violations without giving any legal justifications, and these make the sovereign no less of an enemy to the human race. Okay. So to Vattel it seems that there was value in making plausible legal arguments, but if they're evidently frivolous, they're actually no better than making no legal argument at all. However, it appears that to Vattel, he thought that making a bullshit argument is actually worse than not making any legal argument at all. Why? That's because to him, an evidently false interpretation is the grossest imaginable violation of the faith of treaties. Why? And this was the case for two reasons. Actually, I'd like to say that, Vattel already said everything. Whatever you want to say about international law, it's there. Okay, there are two reasons why these types of arguments are actually the worst type of violation of the faith of treaties. One, because making such a claim impudently sports with the sanctity of treaties, or in modern terms, they discredit the entire system by making a complete mockery of treaties. Or, and that's the second explanation, because of the deceit inherent in such arguments, the person making them is, as Vattel argued, is a puritanical impostor. He wishes, I'm quoting, to act a dishonest part and yet preserve the character of an honest man. His crime is therefore aggravated by hypocrisy. Okay, there are very interesting arguments, examples of in Vattel's Law of Nations of these types of arguments, which are quite entertaining. So I can give you the reference later. So it follows that to Vattel, the idea of bullshit arguments is a threat to the mere idea of sanctity of treaties, one of the foundational principles of international law, for two reasons: either for instrumental reason, it discredits the treaty system as a whole, or for normative reason, it's based not only on disrespect of treaties, but also an attempt to legitimate wrongdoing by appeal to legality. However, another position might see the benefit of bullshit arguments if the alternative is not legal argument at all. If this is true, we would prefer that Russia advance bad legal arguments than simply say, well, we invaded because it's our national interest or because we want to. Now, classically, this approach was expressed by courts, such as the ICJ in the Nicaragua case, or the US Supreme Court in the Phil Ortega case, according to which, well, a bad argument, if couched within legal terms, actually strengthens the existent norms. And recently, a sophisticated version of this approach was advanced by Monica Hakimi of now Columbia Law School in a very interesting article, Why Should We Care About International Law? So Hakimi argues that as citizens, we should always prefer legal arguments rather than arguments based on naked power, which she associated with the Trump administration's America First policy. And to Hakimi, the problem with relying on naked power is that we lose the benefits of what she calls the argumentative practice of international law. The special benefit of the legal argumentative practice is that it requires an appeal to a legitimate authority, and as such acknowledges the limits of power. So it requires those making an argument to provide a coherent public justification on the basis of rationales that don't only apply to them, but to the community as a whole. And following the work of Jeremy Waldron, Hakimi claims that when we abandon the legal argumentative practice, we lose the following values. One, respect. As she argues, participating seriously in international law's argumentative practice conveys respect to those affected by the decisions as subject of the law and allows them to craft their objections. Two, transnational politics. The legal argumentative practice established a common framework through which we can argue, and I quote, structuring in relatively positive ways how parties to the dispute engage. The international legal practice, argumentative practice, does so because arguing in law requires people to draw on a set of shared resources, text, analytical methods, sources of authority, institutions, and so on, to explain why their preferences are consonant with the interests or value of a group. And third, accountability. Legal argument ultimately concedes that decision makers, and I quote, need authority for what they want to do, and that this authority is not entirely of their own making. They must earn it from other actors, the UN Charter, etc. And this allows scrutiny and challenges to this authority. Now, I think, when we consider both positions, this Vattel view and the view that finds inherent value in international legal practice, I think we intuitively can agree with both. It's not a clear-cut debate to me. But I think the Russia case in Ukraine shows at least why we need to tweak and clarify the argument that Hakimi and others approach, and one which gives space to Vattel's classic objections. And my intuition, and I'm not going to say something completely controversial here, I think, is that bullshit arguments, even if formally conveyed in a manner that fits within international law's argumentative practice, fail to promote the benefits that Hakimi identifies, unless we redefine this argumentative practice as crossing some threshold of quality, which we can argue how it should look like. And I think it corresponds, at least with Vattel's intuition, between what would be a plausible argument and a frivolous legal argument. And if we think about the values, and I'm going to finish in a few minutes. So let's think about respect. So Hakimi argues that the international legal argumentative practice conveys respect. So can we really say that a patently bullshit legal argument conveys respect to those affected, to the victims? I think Vattel is right here when we are blatantly wrong, and the person which commits the wrong appeals to bullshit legality, that person denies the obvious unlawfulness of their action in an attempt to legitimate themselves, which is a strange way to show respect. I'm thinking, bringing back, because it's kind of impossible to not consider what's happening here. So when you see what I would argue are explicitly racist political parties appealing to democracy or to human rights as an attempt to justify something, I find personally that it's less respectful of just saying, well, we just want supremacy. Okay, in a sense that's so just an example. Or regarding transnational politics, a bullshit legal argument is so far from the way the norm is usually understood that even if it maintains the formal structure of the legal argument, I think it's doubtful whether it falls within a common framework. It furthermore destabilizes our common understanding and makes us spend precious energy in that really peculiar way in which it's hard to actually engage with really stupid arguments. I'm sorry for being a bit superficial, but I think there's truth to this. And additionally, when bullshit legal arguments are actually phrased as allegations, for instance, Russia's argument that Ukraine is committing genocide, and this is so far off, it's unclear to me how this provides a common framework for debate between Russia and Ukraine on the situation on the ground. I think there's a special wrong in blaming others for committing illegal acts based on bullshit argumentations. And again, regarding accountabilities, so sure, bullshit arguments allow us to hold states accountable, but for this we don't need these arguments. I mean, even if Russia would not advance any legal argumentation, we could easily show why Russia's invasion of Ukraine was patently illegal. So I think there can be at least a preliminary case that there is an inherent value in international law's argumentative practice, but that bullshit arguments don't cut it. And I think Hakimi also alludes to this when she says seriously participating in the practice. So I think the challenge is to kind of try to pry open what we mean by serious participation in the practice of legal argumentation. For this reason, it could be argued that international law would be better off if Putin would not have advanced legal justifications at all. But these are really preliminary thoughts, and I would be happy to open a discussion.
Well.